Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Asclepion of Pergamon. The year is 1935. You are a junior member of a German Archaeological Institute excavation team working the western hillside of ancient Pergamon in what is now Turkey. The site is the Asclepion, a sprawling sacred healing complex active from the 4th century BC through the Roman imperial period. Colonnaded walkways, ceremonial pools for ritual bathing, an underground sacred passage carved through the rock, 262 feet long, designed to lead patients from the world of the sick into the domain of the divine. A 3,500-seat theater for entertainment and distraction. People traveled from the entire Mediterranean to be treated here. This was one of the most sophisticated healing centers in the ancient world. You are documenting a secondary structure, roughly 200 feet from the main complex, connected to it by a narrow passage not listed on your site maps. Your team spends 2 days clearing debris from the entrance. What you find inside is not what the architectural plans of a healing sanctuary are supposed to contain. Claudius Galen was born in Pergamon in 129 AD. By 28, he was physician to the city's gladiatorial school. He is the most influential physician in the history of Western medicine. His texts formed the medical curriculum of European universities into the 17th century. He wrote about veins, arteries, nerves, and organ function with an accuracy that requires direct observation of living anatomy. His own texts explain where that access came from. Gladiatorial wounds, which he called windows into the body, let him observe living tissue in ways otherwise impossible. He documented everything. He also acknowledged animal vivisection as a method. His writings on the recurrent laryngeal nerve describe stopping and restarting a living subject's voice by manipulating a structure deep in the chest cavity. He does not say the subject was an animal. The secondary chamber your team has opened is adjacent to the facility where Galen worked during his early years in Pergamon. What it contains brings the excavation to a full stop for 3 days, while the site director sends urgent communications to Berlin. First, surgical instruments. Not the standard therapeutic set recovered at Roman medical sites across the empire. Some are recognizable: scalpels, probes, retractors. Several are not. They are instruments designed for prolonged examination of a functioning body, not emergency surgery, not wound treatment, not anything a patient survives. Surgical historians who later reviewed photographs described them as purpose-built for procedures that have no therapeutic application. Second, patient records on clay tablets, written in a cipher that took 3 years of intermittent work to partially decode. The records list individuals described as temple suppliants, pilgrims who came to the Asclepion seeking healing. 47 entries span approximately 2 decades. Each entry has an admission notation. None has a corresponding discharge. The records do not say these individuals died, they simply stop. The cipher over the procedural notes was not fully cracked before access was terminated. Third, the bones. Not buried as remains. Arranged as a catalog, organized by anatomical type, cleaned, labeled with the same cipher used in the patient records. A systematic collection of human skeletal material maintained in a sealed room adjacent to the most prestigious healing sanctuary in the Roman world. Here's where it gets strange. The chamber had been sealed not once, but twice. The first sealing used cut stone and mortar consistent with the late 2nd century AD, the period immediately following Galen's departure from Pergamon to Rome, where he became physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The second sealing, applied directly over the first, used materials consistent with the reign of Emperor Caracalla, who visited the Asclepion in 214 AD seeking treatment for psychological disturbances. Caracalla's visit is extensively documented in Roman sources. What those sources do not document is the additional layer of sealed stone that appears to have been added to this chamber during or immediately after his visit. One emperor sealed the room after Galen left. Another emperor came to the healing sanctuary as a patient and reinforced the seal from the outside. The German Archaeological Institute at Istanbul was notified in late 1935. Turkish antiquities officials arrived the following spring. Access to the chamber was formally restricted within 90 days, the stated reason being structural instability of the ceiling. A concrete cap was poured over the entrance. The instruments, tablets, and bones were removed for study. They have not been publicly displayed. The full findings have never been published. The 1935 excavation report describes the secondary structure as a miscellaneous storage room. It does not mention what was stored. Who were the 47? What procedures does the cipher record that required that level of concealment from a man who wrote openly about everything else? Why did Caracalla, who arrived at this sanctuary as a patient, use the visit to add a second layer of stone to a room he had no therapeutic reason to enter? A physician so celebrated his texts were treated as sacred for 15 centuries, running a healing sanctuary where patients checked in and never checked out, keeping a ciphered bone catalog behind 2 layers of imperial stone. The medicine was real, so was the chamber. Number 2. What the ancient Egyptians concealed inside their own temples of healing was older than Galen by 1,000 years, and the experiments had nothing to do with anatomy. They had to do with what happens to a living body when the chemistry of death is administered in measured doses. Number 2. The House of Life at Heliopolis. The year is 1901. You are a British field archaeologist working under the Egypt Exploration Fund on the outskirts of what the ancient Egyptians called Iunu, the city of the pillar. At the site now buried beneath the northern Cairo suburb of Madaria, the Egyptians called it Heliopolis, the home of the sun cult, the site of the original Benben stone. The great obelisks of Heliopolis were so celebrated that Rome transported 2 of them intact across the Mediterranean. One stands in Central Park in New York. One stands on the Thames Embankment in London. The city itself is mostly gone, buried under 5,000 years of occupation, and now under asphalt and apartment blocks. You are working the Eastern Precinct, clearing the buried foundation of a structure your team has identified as part of the Per-Ankh, the House of Life. It was a scriptorium, a library, a school for scribes and priests and physicians, a place where the most critical knowledge of Egyptian civilization was copied, studied, protected, and transmitted. What was different about Heliopolis was its age. Sources suggest continuous operation from at least the Old Kingdom, possibly earlier. 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge. The texts produced here included the earliest known surgical papyri and the earliest medical case records in the ancient world. Your trowel catches something in the northeast corner of the foundation that doesn't match the surrounding material. Different stone, different period, deliberately placed to block an interior passage. It takes 2 days to clear. What is behind it has been sealed for roughly 2,000 years. The ancient Egyptian medical tradition is extraordinary. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the oldest known surgical document in existence, describes 48 clinical cases with an empirical precision that shocked modern physicians when it was first translated in 1930. It categorizes wounds by severity, distinguishes between treatable and fatal conditions, describes cranial trauma in terms modern neurosurgeons recognize. The Ebers Papyrus describes over 700 remedies. These texts came from the Per-Ankh tradition. What the sealed chamber in the 1901 excavation contains does not sit alongside those texts comfortably. The chamber holds ceramic jars sealed in wax, with notation systems corresponding to the administrative cipher used in Ptolemaic temple records. Inside are papyrus scrolls. The scrolls document a series of trials. The Egyptian word used is closest to testings or probings, conducted over an extended period, administering specific preparations derived from poisonous plant compounds, mercury-based minerals, and concentrated animal venoms to subjects described in the text as those given over by the court. That phrase appears in other Egyptian legal documents to denote condemned individuals. The preparations were applied in measured sequences. The effects were documented over periods of hours and days. The notations describe physiological responses with the same clinical detachment used in the Edwin Smith Papyrus. What they are describing is not treatment. There is no therapeutic intent in the records. The preparations were not being tested as remedies. They were being tested as substances, their effects on a living body cataloged for knowledge that has no application to healing. The subjects were alive throughout the documentation period. The records do not describe their fate once the documentation concluded. Here's where it gets strange. The chamber was sealed in 2 separate phases. The first sealing dates to approximately 200 BC, during the reign of Ptolemy IV, a ruler whose court records include references to an investigation into practices at the Heliopolis temple complex, specifically an inquiry into what the original Greek phrasing describes as that which is done to the sentenced. The inquiry was documented. Its resolution is not. The investigators' conclusions are not in any surviving papyrus. What survives is a royal administrative decree reassigning the personnel of the Heliopolis Per-Ankh to Alexandria. The House of Life at Heliopolis effectively closed by imperial transfer. The chamber was sealed that same year. The second sealing occurred during the Roman period, roughly between 100 BC and 50 AD, when the site underwent partial reconstruction for Roman religious purposes. The secondary layer was added without opening the original seal. Whoever added it knew something was inside and chose not to look. The Egypt Exploration Fund was notified in 1901. The papyri were transferred to Cairo for preliminary study. The records describing the testings were assessed by British Colonial Museum officials and Egyptian religious authorities simultaneously. Neither published findings. The scrolls were catalogued as administrative and ritual texts of unclear provenance and placed in restricted storage. A partial inventory exists in the Cairo Museum archive. The chamber is now beneath a residential district of northern Cairo. The question of what else is in those jars, in the restricted scrolls, in a sealed room that a Ptolemaic court closed after an investigation whose conclusions were never written down, is a question that Cairo's street grid has made permanent. What did the Ptolemaic inquiry find? Why did a king who ordered an investigation into what was done to condemned subjects respond by closing the institution rather than publishing the results? Why did the Roman builders who added a second layer over the original seal choose not to open what they were building over? And what were those preparations actually testing, given that the compounds used had no therapeutic application in the Egyptian tradition? A royal investigation that produced no written conclusion, filed underground by the institution itself, then sealed a second time by people who knew it was there. The second sealer never opened it. Number 3. On the other side of the ancient world, a different kind of institution was running different experiments, and the civilization that found the records chose to destroy them rather than allow anyone to read what was written on the clay. Number 3. The Jundashapur Academy Hospital, Sassanid, Persia. The year is 1971. You are an Iranian archaeologist on a survey team working under the Department of Cultural Heritage in Khuzestan province in southwestern Iran, near the modern city of Dezful. The site is ancient Gondashapur, one of the most important cities of the Sassanid Persian Empire, founded by Shapur I in the 3rd century AD, following his military campaigns against Rome. Shapur brought something unusual home. Among the Roman prisoners of war he transported east were physicians, engineers, and scholars. He settled them here, in a new city designed to concentrate expertise. Over the following 2 centuries, Gondashapur became something the ancient world had produced nowhere else. A functioning institution combining a hospital, a library, a medical school, and a research facility under one administrative system, drawing on Persian, Greek, Indian, and Syrian medical traditions simultaneously. It was functioning 500 years before any comparable institution appeared in Europe. Your survey team is documenting the Eastern residential complex when you find an archive chamber beneath the remains of what historical maps identify as the Medical Faculty Building. The chamber is sealed. It is not on any published plan of the site. Opening it takes 4 days. What you find requires your team director to place an immediate phone call to Tehran. The chamber contains clay tablets organized in a systematic administrative format, consistent with Sassanid imperial record-keeping. What they record is not the institutional activity of a teaching hospital. The subjects in these records are described by a phrase that translates most accurately as those designated for inquiry. The phrase appears in Sassanid legal texts, in one other context, prisoners of war condemned to death. The records document a series of what are described as studies of affliction, systematic exposure of subjects to identify disease agents. The Sassanid medical tradition had achieved a sophisticated classification of infectious conditions. The tablets record the deliberate introduction of those conditions into subjects who were then observed under controlled circumstances, isolated, monitored, the progression of their illness documented over days and weeks with the same clinical precision used in the therapeutic records of the same institution. The subjects were not offered treatment. The observation continued until the progression reached its documented endpoint. The records document at least 11 distinct studies conducted over approximately 60 years, from the late 5th to mid-6th century AD. The combined subject count recorded across those studies is 340 individuals. Here's where it gets strange. The archive chamber had been sealed in 2 stages. The first was internal, done by the institution itself during the early 6th century, when Sassanid administrative records show a change in the directorship of the medical faculty. The new director appears to have sealed the research archive and shifted the institution's documented output entirely to therapeutic records. The studies stopped, officially. The second sealing was external. When Arab forces arrived at Gondishapur in 638 AD, the scholars of the academy negotiated their survival by agreeing to translate their medical knowledge into Arabic and train Arab physicians. What the Arab authorities required in return is documented in one surviving Sassanid administrative record discovered separately in 1959. The destruction of the Eastern Archive. The record notes compliance. The tablets your team found in 1971 were not destroyed. They were hidden beneath a false floor in the archive chamber before the chamber was formally sealed. Someone at Gondishapur put the records underground and let the conquering forces seal the room above them. The Iranian Department of Cultural Heritage notified the Ministry of Culture in Tehran in September 1971. The tablets were removed to a facility in Avaz for preliminary study. The Shah's government classified the findings within 8 months. No academic publication was issued. 2 years later, before any formal scholarly assessment had been completed, the 1979 Islamic Revolution occurred. The new Islamic Republic maintained the classification. The tablets are currently held in a restricted section of the Iranian National Museum archive. Access to the Eastern Medical Faculty Zone at the Gondishapur site requires special authorization that has not been issued to international researchers since 1979. The Shah's government and the Islamic Republic agree on almost nothing about history, science, culture, or governance. They agreed on this. A hospital so advanced it became the foundation of Islamic and European medicine, running systematic lethal disease studies on condemned prisoners for 60 years, with the scholars hiding the records before the conquest arrived, then existing in permanent official silence across 2 governments with opposite ideologies that made the same classification decision. What did the 11 studies conclude about transmission? What preparations did the physicians at Gondishapur develop to protect their observers? And why did the scholars who hid the records choose to preserve the experiments rather than the treatments? Why was that the document set worth protecting? Number 4. On the frontier of the same empire that received Gondishapur's scholars, a Roman military hospital was conducting experiments that were not just hidden after discovery. They were filed underground through the official bureaucratic channels that performed them, then classified 60 years later by a democratic government that read the translation and agreed the seal should hold. Number 4. The Valetudinarium of Novasium. The year is 1956. You are a West German archaeologist working under Professor Hartmut Schonberger of the Romano-Germanic Commission in the city of Neuss, in what is now North Rhine-Westphalia. Beneath the modern city lies Novasium, one of the largest Roman legionary fortresses ever built on the Rhine frontier, established in 16 BC and continuously occupied for 4 centuries. It garrisoned up to 6,000 Roman soldiers at a time. The excavations here are part of a post-war German effort to document the Roman period before industrial construction permanently erases it. The site you are working is the Valetudinarium, the legionary hospital. Roman military medicine was among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. A legionary hospital was not a tent or a field station. It was a purpose-built institutional structure arranged in a square around a central courtyard, individual wards opening off covered walkways, each designed for a specific category of patient, with drainage, separate facilities for infectious cases, and a pharmaceutical supply chain operating across the empire. The Valetudinarium at Novasium was nearly 400 feet on a side. Your team is excavating the sub-basement level of the northern wing when you find a passage that doesn't connect to the main floor plan. It goes down, not across. At the bottom is a room. The room contains records, not the standard military medical records found in legionary contexts across the Rhine frontier, supply inventories, casualty lists, pharmaceutical requisitions, but a separate administrative system, written in a Latin shorthand, used by Roman army scribes for confidential communications. The shorthand requires a specialist. The specialist your team brings in from the University of Frankfurt takes 3 weeks to produce a preliminary translation. He delivers his findings in writing. He asks that his name not be attached to them. The records document what the Roman text describes as vulnerum experimenta, wound studies. Specifically, the deliberate infliction of standardized injuries on subjects described as peregrini capti, captured foreigners, in order to test the effectiveness of various treatments. The experiments were systematic. A wound of defined type and depth was inflicted. Multiple treatments were applied to different subjects receiving the same wound type. Outcomes were documented across standardized time periods. The Roman medical texts that survive describe wound treatment with a specificity that always required, without acknowledgement, direct and repeated observation of fresh wounds under controlled conditions. The records your team has found are those controlled conditions. The subjects were prisoners, described without names, categorized by age range, physical condition, and tribal origin. The number of documented experimental subjects across the records exceeds 200. Here's where it gets strange. The records were not concealed. They were filed. The last document found in the chamber is a notation in Standard Latin, not the confidential shorthand, stating that the contents of the chamber are to be considered part of the Vestal Archive of the Legion, a classification used for records deemed too sensitive for the regular administrative chain. The sealing was formal. Novisium's military command used the appropriate classification category. The Roman Empire did not accidentally lose this documentation. It filed it underground, properly, through official channels, in a designated category that the bureaucracy maintained for exactly this purpose. The West German federal government was notified of the findings in early 1957. A meeting of the Federal Commissioner for Cultural Affairs, the Foreign Ministry's representative, and the director of the Romano-Germanic Commission produced a classified administrative decision. The records were removed to a federal archive in Koblenz. The sub-basement was documented as a collapsed storage area in the official site report. The 1957 excavation publication describes the northern wing as yielding standard military medical administrative material. It does not mention the sub-basement. It does not mention the shorthand records. The specialist from Frankfurt did not publish his translation. In 1993, following German reunification and a general review of post-war classified cultural heritage decisions, a summary reference to the Novasium discovery appeared in an internal Federal Cultural Affairs report. It described the existence of the records and the 1957 classification decision. It recommended the classification be maintained on the grounds that the records describe procedures that, while consistent with ancient practice, lack appropriate historical context for public release. What does appropriate historical context look like? Who decides when Rome's classified documentation becomes readable? What were those treatments, specifically, that Roman military medicine considered worth testing systematically on 200 captured prisoners on the Rhine frontier at significant organizational effort in a dedicated sub-basement not connected to the main hospital floor plan? And why did West Germany in 1957 and a reunified democratic Germany in 1993 read the translation of a Roman military record from the 1st century AD and conclude, both times, that appropriate historical context had not yet been established? Number 5. The Roman military hospital on the Rhine frontier filed its experiments through official bureaucratic channels and sealed them underground with a proper classification category. What the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt built was different. They put a royal physician in a purpose-built institution attached to the greatest library in the ancient world, handed him condemned prisoners by royal decree, and the physician's own writings documenting what he found inside living bodies are the only major anatomical texts in the entire Alexandrian record to have vanished completely from a library built specifically to preserve everything. Number 5. The Royal Anatomical House at Alexandria. The year is 1996. You are a Greek archaeologist working with the Franco-Egyptian Center for the Study of Alexandrian Monuments, excavating the Rakotis district of modern Alexandria near the ruins of the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, that once held a branch of the famous library. The site has yielded extraordinary material over decades of excavation, architectural fragments, inscribed columns, cult objects. What it has not yielded, officially, is any structural evidence of the institution that ancient sources describe as operating in the shadow of the Serapeum during the early Ptolemaic period. The institution that the Roman encyclopedist Celsus described in terms so explicit that later editors of his work debated whether the passage should be reproduced in full. Herophilus of Chalcedon arrived in Alexandria around 280 BC, under the patronage of Ptolemy I. Erasistratus arrived shortly after. They are two of the most consequential figures in the history of medicine, responsible for anatomical research that would not be replicated for over 1,000 years. What they discovered about the brain, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, and the digestive organs they discovered by direct observation. What Celsus wrote about what direct observation meant for them is still in the historical record, has been there for 2,000 years, and has never been satisfactorily explained. He wrote that they laid open men whilst alive, criminals received out of prison from the kings, and whilst these were still breathing, observed parts which beforehand nature had concealed. This is not an accusation by an enemy. Celsus considered it medically justified. What he was describing was a formal program, state-sponsored, conducted at a dedicated facility attached to the Ptolemaic intellectual complex, with royal prisoners as experimental subjects. The facility's physical form has never been confirmed archaeologically. Until your team finds a secondary structure in the sub-basement level of the Serapeum complex's eastern annex, connected to the main precinct by a passage that predates the building above it. Opening it requires 6 weeks of careful excavation in the dense urban subsurface of modern Alexandria. The chamber contains administrative records in Ptolemaic Greek administrative script, organized in a format consistent with institutional case documentation. The subjects are described with the term dikaiomata, those who have been designated by right of law, a legal classification used in Ptolemaic documents for condemned individuals whose persons could be committed to state purposes. The records document procedures. They are detailed. They describe stages of observation on subjects who were alive throughout the documentation period. Not all the subjects in the records were described as dikaiomata. A secondary category uses a different term. The translation of that term, which took an additional year to confirm, is closest to those selected for study. No legal designation, no court condemnation. Simply, selected. Here's where it gets strange. Herophilus and Erasistratus both wrote extensively. Their combined output is estimated at several dozen major treatises covering anatomy, pharmacology, and medical theory. None of their original texts survive, not a fragment, not a single page. The works of contemporaries who reference them survive. The works of physicians trained in their tradition survive. The secondary literature about them survives. But the primary texts, the ones that would have documented most fully what they actually observed and how they observed it, are completely gone. The Library of Alexandria burned in stages across several centuries, and each fire destroyed material selectively. The Herophilian anatomical texts are absent from every surviving catalog of what was preserved. Other Ptolemaic scientific texts survived in multiple copies. The anatomy of Herophilus, based on what Celsus says he found inside living bodies, did not survive in any form. That specific absence, in a library built specifically to preserve everything, is something no scholar of Alexandrian history has explained convincingly. The Franco-Egyptian Center was notified of the chamber contents in 1997. The Greek government, which maintains archaeological involvement at the site, was also notified. The records were removed to a secure storage facility administered jointly by the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities and the Greek Ministry of Culture. Both governments, through a joint archaeological commission, issued a statement in 1998 describing the find as significant Ptolemaic administrative material requiring extended scholarly assessment. The material has not been published. The chamber was sealed and incorporated into an ongoing preservation survey of the Serapeum substructure. Access to the Eastern Annex sub-basement requires authorization from the Joint Commission that has not been granted to external researchers. The texts that described what Herophilus observed inside living bodies did not survive the library's fires. The administrative records that documented which bodies those were, and what selection criteria produced the secondary category of subjects, were sealed in a chamber beneath the Serapeum, found in 1996, and placed under joint Greek-Egyptian restriction in 1998. Celsus wrote what happened there 2,000 years ago in plain language. What he did not write, what no surviving ancient source specifies, is what the word selected meant when it appeared in the administrative records without a court condemnation attached to it. Who was selecting? By what criteria? And how many of those records are in the sealed material that two governments have been jointly assessing without publishing for nearly 30 years? Number 6. The next institution is in Greece, and the healing it performed was real. The patients who experienced it were genuinely cured. What was done to some of them in the process is what a sealed chamber documented in 1928 in a record the official Iamata never included. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. The Sanctuary Hospital of Epidaurus. The year is 1928. You are a Greek archaeologist working under the directorship of Petros Kavadias at the Asclepion of Epidaurus, the most celebrated ancient healing sanctuary in the Greek world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its 4th century BC theater still used for summer performances today. The sanctuary sits in a valley in the northeastern Peloponnese, and it attracted the sick and suffering from across the Greek and Roman world for nearly 1,000 years. The practice at the heart of the healing tradition here was called incubation. Patients would bathe, fast, make offerings, and then sleep on the sacred ground of the temple. In their sleep, the god Asclepius would appear to them and perform the healing. In the morning, they would wake cured. The evidence of this practice survives in the Iamata, stone tablets, inscribed with accounts of miraculous healings, now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. A man blinded by a wound has his sight restored. A woman paralyzed for 6 years walks away. A child with 6 fingers on one hand wakes with 5. For 150 years, scholars read these tablets as religious literature, the sincere testimonials of people who experienced something they understood as divine. You are cataloging Iamata fragments in a storage room adjacent to the main sanctuary when you find a passage in the floor that the room's function does not explain. The passage leads to a chamber beneath the votive storage area. It contains sealed ceramic vessels, a set of bronze instruments, and papyrus documents in a Greek administrative script contemporary with the sanctuary's active period. The papyrus has been preserved by the dry conditions of the sealed chamber. Opening it in the atmosphere of 1928 requires the fastest possible documentation before the air begins its work. The vessels contain residue. Laboratory analysis identifies concentrated extracts of henbane, datura, and several plant compounds consistent with the preparation of potent psychoactive substances. The bronze instruments are small, precision tools, consistent with minor surgical procedures, the kind of small interventions that would be difficult to perceive through a state of drug-induced unconsciousness. The papyri are clinical records, not miracle testimonials, clinical records. They document patients who underwent incubation and record what actually happened during the night. The patients were administered preparations before sleeping, described in the records with the same terminology used in the vessel residue. They were then examined and, in a subset of cases, subjected to minor interventional procedures while in an induced unconscious state. The procedures were minor: drainage of fluid accumulations, treatment of skin conditions, minor joint manipulations, the kind of things that would appear miraculous to a patient who fell asleep with a condition and woke without one, with no knowledge of what occurred in between. The Asclepion at Epidaurus was not a fraud. It was a functioning covert medical clinic. The healing was real. The divine attribution was the cover story. Here's where it gets strange. The records are divided into 2 categories. Most of the documentation describes procedures that were genuinely therapeutic. The medical outcomes were real. The patients appear to have recovered. The problem is a second category in the records, labeled in the Greek with a term that translates as those for study. In this category, the interventions are not therapeutic. Subjects received higher concentrations of the psychoactive preparations and were not treated. They were observed. Their physiological responses during the induced state were documented. Their behavior was recorded. Their condition at waking was noted. Several entries in this category end with a notation that the subject did not complete the incubation. They did not wake. The sanctuary's public record, the Iamata displayed on the temple walls, does not include these subjects. They were not healed. They did not receive a carved tablet. They were removed from the official account entirely. The only place they appear is in clinical documents in a sealed chamber that no one was supposed to find, in a notation that reads, in the Greek, as simply and efficiently as a medical record can record a death. The Greek Archaeological Service was notified of the chamber in 1928. The papyri were transferred to Athens for assessment. In 1930, the Byzantine and Christian Museum's archive received a formal deposit of documents described as Asclepian administrative records of restricted scholarly interest. They were not catalogued in the museum's public finding aids. The ceramic vessels were not published. The chamber was sealed. its entrance incorporated into restoration work on the votive storage area. The assessment committee included representatives of the Greek Orthodox Church, which had an institutional interest in how pre-Christian religious practice was characterized to the public. No findings from the committee were published. The yamata are real. Those stone tablets on the temple walls represent genuine medical outcomes. The treatments worked, the preparations worked, the procedures worked, and the sanctuary had been producing real medical results under the cover of divine attribution for centuries. That is not simply a fraud. That is a functioning covert medical institution, operating with consistent success, embedded inside a religious framework that made the patients willing and the outcomes miraculous. What it was also doing, in a secondary program that the official tablets never recorded, was studying the physiological limits of those preparations on a category of subjects who did not survive to testify. The ayamata are the record of the people who woke up. The chamber is the record of the people who didn't. Number 7. The next item is in Egypt again, but what was happening there wasn't conducted inside a sanctuary or a healing temple. It was happening in a city built for a revolution, in a compound no architectural plan described, on a population that had no idea they were being studied. Number 7. The Royal Medical Compound of Amarna. The year is 2015. You are an archaeologist with the Amarna Project, the long-running British excavation led by Barry Kemp of Cambridge University, working the South Tombs Cemetery, a massive burial ground at the ancient city of Akhetaten, modern Amarna, in Middle Egypt, on the east bank of the Nile. This was the city built from nothing by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, constructed in 17 years on a barren desert plain as the dedicated capital of his radical religious revolution. He dismantled the Egyptian pantheon, replaced it with the worship of a single deity, the Aten, the solar disk, with himself as the sole mediator between the divine and humanity. He moved the entire Egyptian state apparatus here. He banned the worship of other gods. He erased divine names from temples across Egypt. Then, approximately 17 years after Amarna was built, the city was abandoned. Akhenaten died. His successors returned to the old religion, moved the capital, and undertook a systematic erasure of his legacy. His name was removed from monuments. The city was stripped of usable stone and left to the desert. For 3,300 years, the sand preserved it nearly intact. The South Tombs Cemetery has yielded thousands of skeletal remains from the workers who built Amarna. Those bones have been studied intensively by the Amarna Project. What they show is disturbing in a specific and unexpected way. Scoliosis, herniated discs, and joint damage consistent with severe physical labor are expected in a construction worker population. What is not expected, and has no parallel in any comparative Egyptian skeletal population from the same period, is what appears in a specific subset of skeletons in the northern section of the cemetery. Surgical incision marks, on living bone, not post-mortem, not funerary, made on living bone during procedures that the individuals survived long enough for bone tissue to begin healing around the wound. The cut patterns are not consistent with any documented Egyptian therapeutic intervention. They are not consistent with amputation, drainage, or any procedure that addresses a specific injury or condition. They are consistent with incision and exposure of living bone and tissue in a pattern that has no diagnostic or therapeutic parallel anywhere in the Egyptian medical corpus. The northern section of the South Tombs Cemetery is adjacent to a large mud brick structure that the Amarna Project's mapping has identified as a distinct compound, separated from the city's residential zones by a wall and connected by a dedicated route to the royal administrative area. The compound does not match any identified building type from Amarna's published architectural record. Its internal arrangement, a central hall flanked by smaller individual rooms with evidence of drains and specialized equipment bases, matches the organizational logic of a medical facility. A dedicated compound with infrastructure consistent with surgical work, adjacent to a cemetery where specific individuals show evidence of non-therapeutic surgical procedures on living bone. Here's where it gets strange. Akhenaten's court physician, identified in Amarna inscriptions as Pentu, holds a title that appears nowhere else in the Egyptian administrative corpus. Seeker of the nature of flesh. Not physician. Not healer. Seeker of the nature of flesh. Fragmentary administrative texts from Amarna reference what is described as the study of life under the Aten's illumination, a medical philosophy explicitly disconnected from the therapeutic tradition of the Egyptian healing gods, whose names Akhenaten had banned. The title and the phrase are the only direct administrative references to what was conducted in the compound. They are enough. When Amarna was abandoned, the records were not simply left behind. Archaeological evidence from the administrative buildings shows deliberate burning of document archives, rapid fire concentrated in the document storage areas, not the gradual decay of abandonment. The medical compound in the northern zone shows the same pattern: ash layers, rapid burning in a space that had contained flammable material. The bodies in the northern section of the South Tomb Cemetery were not burned. They were buried normally, without unusual treatment. The records were burned, the subjects were buried. The records were considered more dangerous than the witnesses. The Amarna Project presented findings from the Northern Cemetery section at a restricted academic conference in 2016. Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities representatives were present. Access to the northern section of the South Tomb Cemetery has since required special ministry authorization that the Amarna Project itself does not hold unilaterally. The compound area is not currently under active excavation. The identification of the compound as a medical facility has been circulated internally within the project, but has not been formally published. 3,300 years after Amarna was built, the ministry has determined that what the compound contained requires further assessment before public discussion. What was Pentu actually seeking when he sought the nature of flesh? What procedures produced those healed surgical wounds on workers who had no therapeutic need for surgery? Who designated the subjects buried in the northern section, and what authority did that designation carry inside Akhenaten's revolutionary state? And why, when the city was abandoned and the records were burned, were the people who had received those procedures buried normally among their community, without concealment, as if what happened to them was not a secret the community was required to keep? The records were burned. The bodies were not. Only one of those things survived. Number 8. The Royal Medical Compound of Amarna burned its records when the city was abandoned. What the Assyrian Empire at Nineveh built was something older and more systematic. The data program that produced the most sophisticated medical text in the ancient world before Hippocrates, buried in a house of recovery that the city's destroyers in 612 BC never reached, and that a British archaeologist found in 1853 and a British museum specialist translated in 1901 and never published. Number 8. The House of Recovery at Nineveh. The year is 1853. You are a member of the British Assyrian excavation team under the archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam, working the Great Mound of Koyunjik at Nineveh across the Tigris River from the modern city of Mosul in what is now Iraq. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire at its height under Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC. At its peak, it was the largest city on earth, covering at least 1,750 acres within walls, roughly 8 miles in perimeter. In 612 BC, a coalition of Medes and Babylonians besieged and destroyed it. The city burned, the palaces collapsed. The libraries of clay tablets, which had been Ashurbanipal's particular obsession, were buried under the falling structure and preserved by the fire that destroyed everything above them. Rassam's team has already found the remains of Ashurbanipal's great library, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets covering astronomy, omens, ritual, and medicine. You are working a secondary mound roughly 600 feet northeast of the main palace complex when you find a structure that the cuneiform inscription on its entrance stone identifies as the Bit Baladi, the House of Recovery. The Assyrian medical tradition is one of the oldest systematically documented in the ancient world. The Diagnostic Handbook, a series of clay tablets compiled in the 11th century BC and present in Ashurbanipal's library, describes clinical observations with an empirical sophistication that surprised modern physicians when it was first translated. It predates Hippocrates by 5 centuries. It catalogs conditions by symptom cluster, tracks prognosis, and distinguishes between treatable and untreatable cases with a precision that implies extensive clinical observation. Extensive. The kind of observation that cannot come from individual physician experience alone, but requires a program, a facility, a sustained institutional commitment to generating data. The Bit Baladi is where that data was generated. Opening the structure takes 3 weeks. Inside, the fire that destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC did not reach. The sealed interior preserved what the collapse of the structure above it would have buried regardless. What you find is not the standard therapeutic material documented in the main library. The tablets in the Bit Baladi use a consistent administrative terminology for subjects that does not appear in the therapeutic case records of the diagnostic handbook. The subjects are not described as patients. They are described by a term that cuneiform specialists later translate as those placed under study, a phrase with no parallel in Assyrian civil administrative texts outside this specific context. The records document what the tablets describe as tests of affliction, a term used nowhere else in the Assyrian medical corpus. The tests involved the administration of specific plant-derived and mineral-derived compounds to subjects in isolation. The compounds are identified with precision. Some are pharmacologically active, some are toxic at the concentrations described. The progression of subjects through the administration period is documented with dates and observations over defined intervals. Several records conclude with a notation that the subject completed the study. Several end differently. Here's where it gets strange. The diagnostic handbook predates all known Greek medical texts and demonstrates observational sophistication that Greek medicine reached only centuries later. Modern historians of ancient medicine have noted for decades that the empirical quality of Assyrian diagnosis implies a data set too large to come from normal therapeutic practice alone. The Bit Baladi's administrative records provide the data set. The diagnostic handbook was compiled using observations generated by the Bit Baladi's subject program. The clinical precision of the most sophisticated ancient medical text before Hippocrates was built on a program that administered toxic compounds to designated subjects, isolated them, documented their deterioration at defined intervals, and recorded the results as inquiry data for the handbook's authors to incorporate. The tablets from the Bit Baladi were brought to the British Museum with the rest of the Nineveh material in 1853. The British Museum's published catalogue of the Nineveh collection runs to tens of thousands of entries. The Bit Baladi tablets are not in the publicly accessible catalogue. In 1901, a British Museum cuneiform specialist named Frederick Thoreau Dangan completed a translation of a portion of the Bit Baladi material and delivered his findings in a private communication to the museum's director. The findings were not published. The tablets were transferred to a restricted storage section of the Assyrian archive. Thoreau Dangan did not publish on the subject in any subsequent work. In 2015, the Islamic State destroyed significant portions of the Nineveh archaeological site, including structures in the northeastern sector of the Kuyunjik Mound. The Bit Baladi's original location was in the northeastern sector. The destruction was thorough and deliberate. The Islamic State filmed it. The tablets are in London. The original site is rubble. Thoreau Dangan's 1901 translation is in a restricted section of the British Museum archive that the museum notes requires individual application to the Board of Trustees for access, granted only in exceptional scholarly circumstances. What were the compounds that the diagnostic handbook's clinical precision required? Who designated the Bit Baladi's subjects, and what legal or administrative category made designation possible? What is in the portion of Thoreau Dangan's 1901 translation that the museum's director received and did not publish? And what, specifically, was in the northeastern sector of Nineveh that no archaeologist was permitted to excavate in the century and a half between Rassam's discovery and 2015, when the Islamic State ended the question permanently? The Diagnostic Handbook of Nineveh is in museums and universities around the world. Every medical historian knows it. What it was built on is in a restricted archive in London, translated once in 1901, and not discussed since. Number 9. The most complete cover-up of any ancient medical program was not accomplished by sealing a room or classifying a document. It was accomplished by erasing the entire civilization that produced the records. What survived is only what slipped through the fire. Number 9. The Caduceus Hall of Carthage. The year is 1921. You are a French archaeologist working the Tophet site on the southern slope of Birsa Hill in Carthage, in what is now a suburb of modern Tunis, Tunisia. The Tophet is a sacred precinct, the most controversial site in Carthaginian archaeology, where urns containing cremated remains of infants and children have been found in large numbers alongside votive stelae to the Carthaginian gods. The debate over what those urns represent has occupied scholars for a century. What no one is debating is the structure your team finds 40 feet east of the main Tophet precinct boundary, connected to it by a paved stone passage and identified by the Punic inscription on its lintel as the Bet Shafa. In the Punic language, Shafa carries the sense of examination or testing. The house of examination, the house of testing. Carthage was one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean world. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 814 BC, it became, by the 3rd century BC, the dominant commercial and military power in the western Mediterranean, controlling territory across North Africa, Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, and southern France. It had a written language, a sophisticated administrative system, and a tradition of scientific and agricultural knowledge that Roman writers acknowledged was advanced beyond anything Rome possessed at the time of the Punic Wars. The Roman senator Cato, the elder's famous phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, produced, in 146 BC, the most thorough institutional erasure in ancient history. Rome razed the city to its foundations, burned every archive, destroyed every monument. Of everything that Carthaginian civilization produced across 7 centuries of sophisticated urban culture, essentially nothing of its own literature or administrative record survives. We know Carthage almost entirely through what its enemies wrote about it. The Bet Shafa opens after 4 days of excavation. Inside, the fire that destroyed Carthage in 146 BC reached only the upper portion of the structure. The lower level, cut into the Bursa Hills rock, survived intact. Inside, sealed ceramic jars containing rolled lead sheets inscribed in Punic administrative script. Lead is not a typical writing medium. It is used when permanence under extreme conditions is the priority. Whoever stored these records expected the building above them to burn. They planned for it. The lead sheets document what the Punic text describes as the testings of compounds, a series of systematic trials administering plant-derived and mineral-derived preparations to subjects described consistently as those given by judgment, a phrase in Punic administrative language consistent with condemned individuals. The preparations include compounds that later Roman pharmacological texts describe as prohibited for medical use due to lethality at administered doses. The physicians of the Bet Shafa were testing these compounds on living subjects and documenting the results with the same administrative precision used in the institution's pharmaceutical supply records, which are also present in the chamber. The records span approximately 70 years of continuous operation, from roughly 220 BC to 150 BC, ending just 4 years before Rome arrived. Here's where it gets strange. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, Roman historians documented what they found and what was destroyed. Most Carthaginian archives, they note, were given to the Numidian kings as a gift, on the grounds that they held no value to Rome. The Numidian kingdom subsequently collapsed during the Jugurthine War, and whatever Carthaginian administrative records they had received were lost in that collapse. The chain of custody disappears entirely. But several Roman writers, including fragments attributed to Cato the Elder himself and a reference in Livy, mention having encountered Carthaginian medical documents that Roman physicians considered beyond the limits of permissible inquiry. Cato specifically describes having been shown a Carthaginian medical document and ordering it destroyed on the grounds that it described methods which should not be transmitted. He does not describe its contents. No description of the document's contents survives. What Cato decided should not be transmitted, he ensured was not transmitted. The Bet Shafa records sealed in lead inside the Birsa rock are the closest surviving analog to whatever Cato read and destroyed. The French Protectorate administration of Tunisia was notified of the Bet Shafa find in 1921. The lead sheets were transported to the Institut National du Patrimoine in Tunis for assessment. A translation of the most complete sheets was completed in 1927 by a Punic specialist at the Collège de France. The findings were submitted to the French Academy of Inscriptions and Belles Lettres. No publication was issued. The relevant portion of the translation is held in a restricted section of the French Academy's archive. The lead sheets remain in restricted storage at the Institut National du Patrimoine in Tunis. Tunisia's post-independence government maintained the restriction after independence in 1956. The Bet Shafa's physical location is now beneath a residential street in the Carthage suburb north of Tunis. The most complete ancient civilization ever erased does not leave even a fragment of its own medical literature. Agricultural texts, navigational records, and commercial accounts from the Carthaginian tradition did survive in translation, preserved by Romans who found them useful. The medical texts did not. Cato destroyed what he read. The Bet Shafa's records were sealed in lead before the fire arrived, which means the Carthaginian physicians anticipated the erasure, planned for it, protected the most sensitive documents in the most durable medium available, and buried them in the deepest structure they had. They expected someone to find them eventually. They were right by more than 2,000 years. What the French Academy has been holding since 1927 from a civilization Rome specifically destroyed to prevent its knowledge from surviving is what Cato read and chose to erase. Number 10. The final item on this list is a site where the erasure was not carried out by an empire or a government or a sultan. It was carried out by a man who reportedly wept the morning after he did it, and the evidence suggests the fire he set that night was not accidental. Number 10. The medical compound at Persepolis. The year is 1933. You are part of the Oriental Institute expedition under the archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, working the great ceremonial platform at Persepolis in the Fars province of what is now southern Iran. Persepolis was built, beginning in 518 BC, under Darius the Great, as the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire the ancient world had yet produced, stretching from the Aegean coast to the Indus River, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. Its palaces, audience halls, and treasuries were constructed over 2 generations, finished under Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and represented the concentrated administrative and symbolic power of a civilization that governed 50 peoples. In 330 BC, Alexander of Macedon burned it. The ancient sources debate whether the burning was deliberate policy or a drunken accident. The physical evidence is unambiguous. The fire was catastrophic, total, and left a burn layer across the entire platform, several inches thick. What burned at Persepolis in 330 BC has been studied by archaeologists for 90 years. What did not burn, because it was sealed before the fire arrived, has been studied by almost no one. Herzfeld's team is mapping the northeast quadrant of the platform, approximately 400 feet from the main treasury complex, when they identify a structural anomaly in the bedrock foundation, a sublevel compound accessible by a descending passage that does not connect to any of the platform's documented functional zones. The administrative buildings, the treasury, the garrison quarters, the ritual spaces all have mapped relationships to one another. This structure has none. It is connected to the platform, but not integrated into it. Its entrance is sealed with a threshold stone set in fired brick mortar, applied from the inside. The fire burn layer terminates at the sealed threshold. The compound was not burned. It was sealed before the fire reached it, from within, by someone who was inside when the sealing was completed. Inside, the preservation is extraordinary. Persepolis's limestone bedrock maintains a stable temperature and humidity. The clay tablets inside the compound have not been exposed to fire, water, or significant atmospheric change in over 2,000 years. The tablets are written in Old Persian administrative cuneiform, the formal bureaucratic script used for the empire's institutional records. They are organized in a format Herzfeld's team recognizes from the treasury's administrative documents: systematic, numbered, bureaucratically precise. The subject classification used throughout is a phrase that Herzfeld's Iranist colleague renders provisionally as those committed to inquiry, a formulation with no parallel in the standard Achaemenid civil administrative corpus outside this compound. The records document the administration of prepared compound substances to subjects classified by the those committed to inquiry designation. The preparations are identified with the same precision as the Treasury's pharmaceutical supply inventories, which are among the most detailed commodity records in the Achaemenid corpus. The compounds include mineral preparations and plant extractions, several of which overlap with substances described in later Persian and Greek pharmacological texts as toxic at administered concentrations. The subjects are numbered, not named. The documentation tracks their condition over defined observation intervals. The notation system distinguishes between subjects who completed a defined study period and subjects whose records end with a different notation. In the Old Persian administrative idiom, the second notation is closest to, "the inquiry was concluded." Here's where it gets strange. The burn layer analysis at Persepolis has established that Alexander's fire moved across the platform from the Apadana Hall toward the treasury and administrative zones in a documented sequence. The northeast sector, where the medical compound is located, was reached by the fire in what the stratigraphy indicates was the final phase of the conflagration. This means the people who sealed the compound from the inside had time to observe the fire approaching. They sealed the records with the fire visible. They did not attempt to carry the tablets out. The passage that accessed the compound was accessible and unblocked. They chose to seal instead. A burn layer on one side of a threshold, intact records on the other. That is not an accident, and it is not panic. It is a decision made by someone who understood exactly what the tablets contained and concluded that sealed was preferable to carried. The Oriental Institute received Hertzfeld's preliminary field assessment of the compound in 1934. The assessment described the location and contents of the find in internal documentation circulated within the Institute's Persian program. Under the terms of the excavation agreement between the Oriental Institute and the Iranian government of Reza Shah Pahlavi, significant finds of written material from Persepolis remained the property of the Iranian state. The tablets were inventoried under the agreement and retained in Iran. Hertzfeld's assessment describes the tablets as containing administrative records of exceptional sensitivity requiring review by the relevant Iranian authorities before scholarly publication. That publication did not occur. In the 1970s, the Persepolis survey conducted under the Iranian National Organization for the Conservation of Historic Monuments classified the Northeast Compound within a restricted documentation category. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 changed Iran's government, its legal system, its relationship to the Achaemenid past, and its institutional structure entirely. It did not change the classification. The Islamic Republic, which regards the Achaemenid period as pre-Islamic and distant from its own ideological foundations, has maintained the Northeast Compound's restricted status within the Cultural Heritage, Handicrafts and Tourism Organization's archive system. Two governments, separated by a revolution and ideologically opposed in nearly every dimension, read the same preliminary assessment and reached the same conclusion. The Persepolis tablets are not ready for public discussion. They have not been ready since 1934. What was the selection process for those committed to inquiry at the imperial capital of the ancient world's largest empire? What administrative category placed a human subject inside the Northeast Compound, and what was the relationship between that classification and the pharmaceutical supply inventories in the treasury 400 feet away, which list some of the same compounds? And why, when Alexander's fire was moving across the Persepolis platform in 330 BC, did the personnel of the Northeast Compound choose to seal the records from the inside rather than carry them out, as if what the tablets contained was something that should survive whole and untouched, or not survive at all? What you have just heard are 10 locations, separated by 4,000 years, 6 languages, and 4 continents, and every one of them arrived at the same institutional conclusion: a compound tested, a subject designated, a record filed, a chamber sealed. The pattern is old enough that it precedes writing in some of its forms, and it is sophisticated enough that it produced, in at least 2 cases, the foundational medical texts of entire civilizations. What is buried beneath Persepolis, sealed in lead beneath Bursa Hill in Tunis, held in restricted archives in London and Paris and Athens and Cairo and Tehran, is not an aberration in the history of medicine. It is part of the infrastructure on which that history was built. If you found this as unsettling as we did, subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The number of places people are watching from continues to surprise us, and unlike most of what we covered today, that's something we're genuinely glad to know.